Welcome to DLSN, a podcast brought to you by McGuireWoods. DLSN promotes the advancement of women in private equity and finance through conversations with women in the private equity and finance space. These conversations provide both insights and practical takeaways to inform your deal work and enhance the culture of your organization. If you're ready to drive the industry toward a more inclusive and diverse environment, then it's time to come to the table.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to DLSN. On today's episode, we want to talk about self-assessments and the power of self-advocacy for women in the finance space. My name is Casey Nelson, and I'm a debt finance associate in our Chicago office. I'm thrilled to be hosting today's episode with Kelly Wray, who's a corporate associate in our Dallas office. Today, we have 3 guests on the show, and we'd like to have them introduce themselves. You will first start with Linda.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. I'm Linda Filardi. I'm a Senior Vice President and Associate General Counsel at Flagstar Bank in New York City. I'm head of credit products. That's basically all the lending products in the commercial and private bank on the commercial bank side. I've spent nearly 30 years in the industry. I started with Big Law at Debevoise and Plimpton, and I continued as a corporate finance associate. I spent over 20 years, the bulk of my career as internal counsel, as an executive at GE Capital in the leveraged finance space. I started with GE in Tokyo, where I was responsible for non-performing loan acquisitions in Asia, and then came back to New York and worked at GE through their acquisition of Heller, Merrill Lynch Capital, and Antares Capital, and then through the sale of Antares to the Canadian Pension Plan. After the sale, I joined Capital One as head of corporate bank lending and stayed there for 5 years. I am now at Flagstar Bank, which is a combination of Flagstar, New York Community Bank, Signature Bank, and a substantial number of bankers from First Republic, as well as U.S. Bank, as we create a new platform and as chairmanship has been taken over by Joseph Otting and ownership by Steve Mnuchin and certain other private equity firms.
Thank you, Linda. Jess, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, thanks for having me. I am Jess Yovich, and I'm currently a senior change manager at Bank of Montreal, located in Chicago. Linda, it's a bit of a small world because I actually spent the first 10 years of my career in commercial lending at GE Capital. I was specifically within healthcare financial services.
Many of my colleagues at Capital One.
Absolutely. Yes. And so when the various platforms were sold off, mine went to Capital One. I took that opportunity to make a pivot in my career, and I pursued a role in professional development and learning at BMO Capital Markets. And learning is a function that often sits within human resources. And a few years into my role, the team was moved from the business into HR. And I really didn't know the first thing about HR or what this would mean for my career, but I quickly discovered that there were a wealth of teams and different roles that I never knew existed. So once I plateaued in the learning role, I took on work to implement strategic HR priorities within the business and gained a lot of experience in change management. And so about a month ago, I moved into a change manager role back in the business within our treasury and payment solutions platform.
Great. Thank you. And then Gretchen, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. I am Gretchen Townshend. I am a partner in the healthcare group at McGuireWoods out of our Chicago office. I've been with McGuireWoods more than 18 years, which is kind of frightening. So I've never worked at GE or in lending, to be clear, but I have dealt with some GE lending transactions here and there. So I've got that connection a little bit. I advise healthcare providers, investors, and lenders of all types on a variety of matters, including regulatory compliance, day-to-day operations, and in transactions of all sizes. One additional thing that I do in my firm hat, wearing my firm hat, is I serve on the firm's associates committee, where we work through the associate evaluation process and how we are, this is related to what we're going to be talking about later, how we are evaluating and providing feedback to associates within the firm, as well as the partnership elevation process and how we evaluate our most senior associates for partnership at McGuireWoods. So some of that is relevant to what we're talking about as well. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Gretchen. And that's a great segue because this topic arose for the podcast, as this is obviously a common time, both in the legal field and in the finance world, to be submitting self-assessments, which as women, we all know that sometimes there's it can be awkward to talk about yourself and advocate yourself for yourself. And some people do consider women who vouch for themselves as bragging or annoying. And so we wanted to do an episode to talk more about, okay, how do we move away from that stereotype, especially in such a male-dominated field? And so we thought it would be interesting for both law firm associates and for finance associates to hear a little bit about how each of your institutions go about evaluating your employees and how that factors into elevation, but also any advice that you would have for your younger selves and for those of us who are still in more junior roles on how we can get over the fear of advocating for ourselves. So, Kelly, I will kick it off to you to ask the first question.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Casey. So really excited to speak with you all today. I know we will be in the time machine just a little bit by the time this episode comes out, but for Casey and I both, our self-assessments were just due this past week. So excited to see how we measure up here. I think that it may be helpful for everyone to sort of level set going in to understand a bit more about what the review and elevation process looks like at each of your respective institutions, so we can see where there's overlap and where there may be some unique factors.
So this is Gretchen. I'll jump off, Kelly, where you and Casey left off. All of our associates at McGuireWoods do self-assessments, as do the partners, for that matter, annually. So we submit and do an evaluation in response to specific questions on our own performance, meeting firm goals, business development, as well as expanding your expertise, things of that nature. And then we move into review season where other people then review every attorney in the firm. You look at that self-assessment. When I'm doing reviews, I look at the self-assessment of the associates and as a means to help me review them as to what they're doing well and where they can make improvements, things of that nature. We then separately have the elevation to partnership process within the firm, as most firms do. So after, in our case, 8 years, usually in the 8th year of the associate ranks, you can be considered for partnership, although that isn't necessarily the exact timeline for everybody. And looking at your skills, your business development, your firm leadership and citizenship, and really the metrics as to whether or not someone is ready to become a partner at McGuireWoods. And so we do that periodically at the end of the year, every year. And then similarly, we do that from income partner to equity partner later on down the road. So really 3 key time frames in a typical full elevation process. And those are the types of things we look at.
And then Linda or Jess, would either of you like to speak to the review process in your respective groups? And this could be just with respect to your direct reports or the experience that you've had to go through in your various roles in the finance world.
Sure. I'm happy to start. So I know that some of you know this on the phone, but just like in a law firm, the review process is very disciplined at GE with the focus on leadership and also at Capital One. And it is done every year. And as I recall, there were mid-year reviews, so you could actually do a check-in more on yourself as to your goals. One of the things that internal counsel has always had to do is to set goals at the very beginning of the year. I'm not sure if that's still the case with lawyers at law firms. And it's a grueling process. At Capital One, it is a joint process that is done with all the lawyers of a particular band as to all the junior people. at GE, there was a forced ranking, and you had to participate in the forced ranking of yourself. And there was guidance, and you looked back at goals that you had set to see whether or not you met them. And there were check-in periods. One of the most important things, I think, is to be realistic in the very beginning of the year. And it's great that we're doing this in January as to what you want to accomplish for the year. You're not only looking back at what you did when you do your self-assessment, but you're also looking forward as to what you intend to do and what your goals are. And that's so hard, I think, for lawyers in particular who get very immersed in their work. And the legal profession can literally eat up your days. And before you know it, you got to 6 months and you look back and you say, what did I want to accomplish for myself? And probably what you did was accomplish a lot for your deal teams and your clients. But did you really get to where you wanted to be in terms of your own personal goals and your own growth? And I think that's a really important thing to always keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. And Linda, when you said there was a forced ranking, I have to ask, is that by person?
There's a ranking system. It's like a bell curve, right?
Okay.
And the forced ranking is of the group. So, if you're in a corporate bank and healthcare, for example, healthcare, you will be ranked with the lawyers across the group. And that's outside of healthcare, like across the whole company at your level. If you're in the corporate bank, for example, or you're in a GE Capital business, or you're in sponsor finance, or you will be ranked side by side to those other lawyers. And that's tough because every business is different and there are different demands and also different criteria as to what constitutes the top ranking. And I think that's where there's the most pain, whether that's in the business capacity or the legal capacity. Ranking also determines compensation. If you don't rank in the highest level, you typically will not be paid because the rankings peg to a bonus level. And there's only so many people that are going to be in the top ranking. Sometimes it's one. And sometimes you might have had the top ranking for 3 years in a row and people are like, we got to give it to John this year because Linda had it for 3 years and we can't do that. So there's that kind of thing that plays out, which people may deem unfair, but that's just the way it works.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. That's interesting. Even here at McGuireWoods, we can see everyone's statistics, which I came from another law firm and that didn't publish all the same statistics. So from my perspective, it was actually a comfort because I can see, okay, my hours are X and my CMI, my fees are Y, and this is where I fall, not just within my own group, but within the firm. So I know for some folks that's too much information, but for me, it was very eye-opening and comforting, but that's an interesting approach. So Jess, for you, you were both on the business side and in the HR side. How does it work at BMO, and is it different in your space versus in the commercial lending capacity?
So at BMO, we start our annual performance cycle with goal setting, and everyone's individual goals ladder up to the strategic priorities of the bank and the segment. And then there's a formal mid-year and year-end performance review. There's input provided by the manager and the peers, and some groups even host formal roundtable discussions to gather feedback on colleagues to ensure that there's a full 360 view. And we use Workday as our HR system, so everything gets recorded in there. And I think it's pretty common across the industry that there is a ranking system that follows a bit of a bell curve. Some companies I know have 5 buckets. At BMO, we have 3 with a target percent of employees in each bucket to create that bell curve. And of course, the rating is tied to variable comp, and for some roles, annual base pay increase potential. Obviously, if you're in a revenue generating role, your sales generation is a large factor in your annual rating and your variable comp potential. Hearing the transparency at the law firms where you're able to see metrics for your peers is pretty interesting to me, because as a firm, we do communicate broadly the rating buckets and the targeted percent that contributes to that bell curve. And each employee does get their rating, but we don't share detailed or aggregate performance information out broadly. And then when we're talking about elevation or promotion, I think at BMO, this is a pretty competitive process, and it considers a wide variety of factors like current performance, growth, potential for client-facing roles, obviously business development, revenue generation, and then alignment to our cultural goals. And I definitely agree with what others said about being known throughout the firm. If you're up for a larger role, such as managing director, and someone on that promotion committee doesn't recognize your name, that's definitely a problem. It's very helpful if you had the opportunity to work cross-functionally, and if you didn't, you definitely need to be networking or seeking out those cross-departmental projects that will get you that name recognition.
And then just for each of you and whoever wants to take this one, please feel free. Kelly and I are getting to the more senior associate roles here at the firm. And I won't speak for Kelly, but I've certainly found that I've had to advocate for myself more. I lateraled over to the firm 2 years ago. I'm a little bit newer than some of the other associates who've been here for their entire career. And so I'm now in a place where I've found that I need to take my show on the road and introduce myself to folks in terms of elevation. And so have there been any specific instances where you've had to advocate for yourself? And in doing so, are there any tips that you like to share with our listeners?
Okay, so I'll take that. Or I could start, and Jess, you pick this up, because I bet we'll say the same thing. I constantly have to advocate for myself. I've had to advocate myself basically through my whole career, and I continue to have to advocate for myself. And you were quite right when you said it does. And there's a lot of statistics on this, and there's a lot of articles that are written about how when women advocate for themselves, it comes out as quote unquote bragging. But that doesn't matter. All right. Because that whether it comes out as bragging or not, you have to do it. Because if you don't advocate for yourself, you may have people who advocate for you, but that's not always consistent. And you don't know in what capacity they're advocating for you. And no matter who advocates for you, mentors, sponsors, or which I've had, there's always, you never know exactly how they're doing that or in what capacity or whether they're covering all the bases that need to be covered. So I think that self-advocacy is one of the most important things for women. And the articles that come out about it being bragging, et cetera, should be ignored, because that's, in my mind, that's a way to just squash the self-advocacy. And what I've seen is the people that are if you're advocating genuinely for yourself based on real accomplishments, there's no reason why you shouldn't be doing it, even if it does come off as bragging. That's the recipient screen. And you shouldn't be put off by someone's screen that it goes through the screen as bragging. That's not really your issue, right? Your issue is you've accomplished 10 things during the year that are measurable, right? And you have to be able to line those up and articulate them. And you can't argue with the facts. And however it feels is not important. What's important is that you accomplish these things and you have to get credit for it. And frankly, most institutions do have a measurement system. There's 5 different ways: leadership roles, external conferences, et cetera, speaking engagements, et cetera, number of transactions, things like that. That's all things that you line up for and you advocate for. And trust me, everyone else is advocating for themselves. And I know this is for women. Men are very good at advocating for themselves, and they do it all year, and they don't just wait for the season to come. And you have to be aware that's going on and that you have to be out there for yourself in a credible way.
Yeah. Okay. And Lyndon, just practically, is this something that you do or you would recommend people do face to face, via email, a little bit of both? Like I guess we struggle with the how. And I think as women, we overthink that. I'll speak for myself in that I like to know, okay, how would I go about doing that? So advice you have on that would be great.
Others to advocate for you, that's great. So in other words, you form a cohort, your buddies at work and people who are supporters to make, yes, by email. That's the first thing. But then also, so they should be advocating and you should say and forward these emails and keep track of them. You advocate for yourself by saying, if nobody says congratulations on closing this deal and you had this input on it, like you drafted the asset purchase agreement or you identified the firm lawyers or you got everybody together, blah, blah, you can go ahead and do that. I'm really pleased to know that this closed and you can use the royal we, but you can say, I was successful in doing the following things. And then second thing I want to really raise, and it has been very important for me throughout my legal career, especially in the last 15 years, is external validation. And I know nobody wants to be on LinkedIn 24 hours a day. And I realize that it has that now, it's becoming like Facebook, et cetera. But it doesn't really matter. If you're out there doing speaking engagements, and McGuireWoods has a lot of seminars, joining the ABA committee, joining the LSTA, volunteering to talk on specific topics, that's really important because that's an external validation. Not only do you meet a lot of people that are going to see you and hear your expertise, which is always the most important, but then you've created an external validation network. So someone challenges, which really doesn't know that much about X, and you've just been interviewed by Bloomberg Law on X, I guess that's not really true, right? And sometimes you're just in an environment, whatever, that you get into in a specific company, in a subsidiary, at McGuireWoods, in your cohort, and you can't make any strides. You feel like you're just not being effective in terms of advocacy. It's just the number of people. However, the constitution of the group is, we're all social animals. Then you need to go outside and get that validation. If you think he's never going to give me credit for this, or she's never going to give me credit for it, you got to find how you're going to get that credit.
I'd like to highlight one of the things Linda said, which is I think it's smart to keep maybe a special kudos folder somewhere where you can dump all those thank yous, those recognitions, internal, external. So that's something that you can mine really easily when you are trying to advocate for yourself. And I definitely agree with Linda's tip to really cultivate those strong peer relationships. And I think setting the precedent that we're going to lift each other up when we know somebody had a huge accomplishment, we're going to make sure we publicly call it out, whether it's verbally on a team call, with a written email, or a recognition platform. Just really making those strong bonds and advocating for each other, I think is easy, and it's easy to reciprocate. And it really facilitates goodwill and put good energy out there.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. Sometimes it is, even for me still, throughout my whole career, it's been hard to advocate for yourself, but advocating for the team, particularly a team in which you lead, but a team that you're on, is much, much easier. And if that is piggyback, if a client sends a kudos email, then forwarding that email on to your supervisor and or the department chair or whoever's in charge of associates or whatever the right parties are to say, this came in. And then you're not even advocating for yourself, but it is by pushing that out even further to folks who might not otherwise know or have a great insight, and then looking for ways to elevate and advocate for others when those opportunities arise. It doesn't do any harm to do it, and then you create the network like we were just talking about. Another practical tip that I utilized when I was growing up through the law firm is to do personal outreach to people in the firm who might not know me, who I thought were important to know me. And in my case, I was remote. And so I went to, when I was up for partner, went to a few female leaders in the firm who knew who I was, but I didn't work with. They were in different departments. One was a litigator and one was antitrust. And I went to them and basically said, I want to be a partner in this firm. I want to know about your experience. Tell me what you did, how you balanced it, how you managed young kids. I was pregnant at the time. How did you do this? And it was a soft advocacy, I think, because I was letting people know what I wanted and that I was willing to work to get there. And I was doing these extra things to get to the right spot. And it was easy because people like talking about themselves. So it becomes a dialogue and an ongoing relationship, a mentoring relationship with somebody who, like I said, really couldn't speak to my work at all. But people who were sitting in the room when some of these decisions were being made and could say, well, I know that she's pushing for it and working hard at it. And it inevitably gives you an opportunity to explain what you're doing to get there in a way that creates some self-advocacy. So I guess that would be my only other practical tip, which is have those one-on-ones with folks not in the guise, because I do think getting practical tips and help from people who've been there and done it is really important and can help you, but also gives you a pretty clean opening to do some soft advocacy for yourself to the folks who might not otherwise know.
And that's really interesting, Gretchen, because I think a lot of us, especially the more junior folks, think that they just need to impress those that they work with. But I think we all know all of our organizations have offices all over the country and in some places all over the world. And you don't really think about this is also a group team environment and reaching out to people that you don't necessarily work with, but might be able to still have the back, I think is a great tip here.
I agree with that I don't think I was as deliberate in my career early on this, but yes, like relationship building. Yes, you're absolutely right. Even if you tend to work in these small groups, right? But you've got to take on projects and things that are outside of your group to build that relationship. And the more people know you and the more true relationships that you've built because you've worked on a project or you've consulted on, you have expertise in a certain area and it comes up in another group and they know to call you. That's really important. So, for example, I was in the sponsor finance group at GE Capital, and they needed a lawyer to cover marketing. And I really didn't have much background to do that, but I volunteered just because I like marketing. And I encountered, and it was so beneficial to me, a whole different world of all the chief marketing officers at GE Capital. And that lifted me out of just the deal work of sponsor finance. And I was personally very satisfied, but also it built so many relationships outside of my group. So I would always advocate to do that.
Great. Yeah. I was lucky to be told early in my career that one of the key elements of elevation is having as many people as possible who are willing to pound on the table for you. And so I think that just that being able to expand beyond any sort of maybe formal mentorship or sponsorship or your typical working team can really help you to expand that pool. So on that note, curious how mentors or sponsors, whether those are formal or informal, have influenced your ability to self-advocate effectively and how you've leveraged those relationships to have them advocate on your behalf as well.
I think for me, having mentors or sponsors really validate that the way that I'm thinking about advocating or the things that I'm pursuing are valid and they're not wild and they're not a stretch and I'm not asking for too much, but that it's really commiserate with the value that I bring to the firm. So I think just having that validation helps with my confidence and my ability to then put forward the best case and self-advocate.
Yep, I totally agree with you. You really do. It's not fatal if you don't, because I know there's so much talk about sponsors and mentors and et cetera, but people succeed very well without them for some reason. But it's so much better when you have people that really appreciate your work and know what you're doing and how you're contributing and watch you and can advocate for you. And it's men and women for lawyers, especially in-house, it's business people as well as lawyers across the company. going out of your way to be helpful, answering emails as quickly as you can, going an extra yard to investigate something that somebody's having trouble with in any particular area, it really pays off because they appreciate that. And lawyers are trusted advisors. And if you think of yourself as somebody who can help others facilitate transactions and problems in a company or in the law firm, and that's really how sponsors and mentors are created, through a natural process of working together.
Yeah. And then I would just add, I think the best thing, my mentors and sponsors, the best things that they did for me were to, number one, put me in a position to lead and have an impact, right? Set you up for success by putting you on teams, giving you responsibilities, putting you in front of clients, things like that, so that you can not only grow your skills, but your relationships with people to then get all of the kudos and all the things that we just talked about. I think it's also really good to have mentors, or ask your mentors, if you haven't, how do they recommend you advocate for yourself? They know you very well, and they know the things that are most noteworthy, where you excel, things you can continue to work on. And my best mentors were folks who gave me a lot of information, gave me comparisons, data in the law firm, right? Where is your CMI compared to someone else? Where is your hours compared to someone else? This is what we're seeing for people when they're up for elevation, for partnership, things of that nature, which is real data that is helpful to help me to then, which was helpful to help me to then set goals and try to exceed those goals and take the steps that I needed to. Whereas I think when you don't have that, or you don't ask for that, you're running a little bit blind. You know what the expectations are, but you don't know who you're competing against and what is standard in some cases. And those kinds of things, I think, were most impactful for my mentors and sponsors as I was growing up, and what I try to do for the folks that I work with who are coming up the ranks.
Yeah, and Gretchen, I completely echo that. As a senior associate and as a lateral into the firm, there were some things that I wasn't clear on with respect to elevation. And the debt finance practice group leader, Kevin McGinnis, provided us with a bunch of statistics and showed us about who may partner this year and what their statistics were. Obviously, information redacted. But it was very eye-opening to see, okay, this is what their CMI was, or this is what their hours were for the last couple of years. And it just made me feel armed with that information, very helpful, and then gave me the statistics that I needed to motivate myself to get to a place where, if I want to be considered for partnership, this is where I have to be.
Absolutely. I think that kind of information and having folks that you can go to who both have that insight from their role. I get a little bit of that in my role in the associates committee. So it's not just people in my own group, but outside who ask me those kinds of questions. What are you seeing for people who are up for partner? But also department chairs and others within our firm. And again, these folks sit in all organizations at various levels, but giving you detailed information so that it's not just the goal. The goal is not just to meet hours. If everybody is making partner is exceeding hours by 500 hours, which is not the case in McGuireWoods, to be clear. But if that is the goal at some other firms, we'll say, you want to know that. Because if you're saying, great, I met my hours, but that's that which is the requirement and the stated goal, but the real goal is something more than that. Having that information gives you the power to make a decision about whether or not that's a goal you're running for or whether it's not, ultimately.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because I think even in both law firm worlds and finance worlds, there's typically there's one main track, but no one really talks about the other tracks. And so I think it's very helpful for everyone to have all the information so that they can make an informed decision. And so on that note, we'll transition a little bit to doing self-assessments. So doing self-assessments is often a very uncomfortable exercise, and it always takes a lot longer than everyone thinks it's going to. And so we wanted to know, do you have any tips in preparing these self-assessments, whether it's your annual one or your semi-annual one, or frankly, your informal vouching for yourself? Do you have any tips that we can give to our listeners for preparing for those assessments?
Yeah, my number one tip would be do it a little bit throughout the year and document what you're doing. I always felt that the self-assessment was so painful, and I realized it was because I wasn't prepping myself throughout the year, and I was leaving it to have to go back and mine all my emails and my documents and find those quantifiable achievements. And when I started keeping a running list of accomplishments, putting a calendar reminder monthly to do it, and just keeping it in a Word doc or whatever is easy for you, it just makes it that much less painful when you get to the end of the year.
And Jess, do you do that? I assume BMO has are they the same questions every year such that you can use your eval from the previous year and then you just use that as a template? Or
we go through a goal setting process very early in the year. So I know exactly what my goals are going to be and what the sub goals are under that. And then, of course, there's things that I work on that don't ladder up to those goals exactly. So I'll make note of those. But yeah, I think it's just more about creating that habit to document it, add it, note it down real time so you're not going back and racking your brain about how did I spend those past 12 months.
Right.
Yeah. And I would add, I think that's really important as you're going through the year. And particularly if you're missing on some things, I tell associates who are struggling with hours, make sure you're keeping good track of the things you're writing and what you're doing, et cetera, et cetera. I think the other component of it is for your own self goals and assessment is to do it periodically. And what we have found in the healthcare group, we have our partners, and we really should do it for everybody, but our partners have quarterly meetings and we do our business development goals and we do it quarterly and we do it as a group. And you're held accountable. Here are my goals. Here are my 3 goals for the next quarter. And then you have to report back and reset your goals, right? And so when you're coming into it and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't do anything. My goals are exactly the same, or I haven't made any progress on this. It keeps it top of mind. So I guess the other advice I would give is to the extent you can, involving others in that process to keep you motivated and on track and accountable for the goals you're setting for yourself and checking in periodically throughout the year so that you're not getting to the end and saying, oh, that was a really great goal and I meant to do that, but it slipped through the cracks.
So in the self-assessment process, curious what recommendations you all might have for our listeners in terms of how to address areas for improvement that you might identify as you're going through that self-assessment process.
Certainly, we all can improve on areas. You need to address areas that you feel should be improved. You just don't really need to harp on it. In other words, tend to be overly critical of themselves and perhaps almost too honest, if there is such a thing, which there probably isn't, but you're trying to achieve something, and that is promotion and getting paid. And we all can improve knowledge of certain areas because we are living in a world that changes constantly no matter what we do. And we probably all can improve communication skills, for example, especially when we're using email and we're in pressure situations and things come off badly from time to time. And that's probably a common thread for many business people in finance, in any kind of pressurized environment. But you should soften the self-improvement. That would be my advice. I see a lot of self-assessments, and for people who really have some fundamental issues, and I don't see really digging into those issues. And I think you should always keep your goal in mind, which is to be promoted. Like in a law firm, it's to make partner or counsel, or to keep your job and to get hired and to do good work, to be the trusted advisor. In a company, it is to be ranked higher so you get paid and to continue to up the organization, typically. So there's no upside to focusing on the problem that you had in X deal or with X person when you've dealt with 1,000 people during the year. Okay, maybe that was a problem, but you know something? And this is where I do really feel there's a difference between men and women. The men have these problems and they seem to bounce back, and they're big problems. It's like it didn't even happen. And the women are like still wringing their hands about, oh, this person said this, and this happened and oh my God, I'm going to get fired and blah, blah, blah. Where the guy like totally screwed something up and he is reprimanded and still is gung ho the rest of the year. It's so true. It's so true. They could take a punch in the face and they get up like it didn't even happen. So resilience, they talk a lot about resilience and grit. And I'm sure I fault myself for this, but I'm trying so hard to tell myself, and I wish to my younger self, don't beat yourself up for things that didn't go exactly the way you wanted it to go. A lot of it is outside of your control, and we're all human beings. And these 3 things happened to the guy next to me, and it never bothered him. It hurt him a single solitary bit.
I've got a funny story about that. My current department chair and boss reminds me frequently about a review I gave her as a first-year associate that recommended she do something different. I would call it constructive criticism, but talk about landing. And she's my boss now, but I still get that every once in a while. I'm totally with you. I often tell folks or try to tell folks to be more duck. Constructive criticism is important. You need to take it to heart. You need to improve, but you also have to somewhat let it roll it off your back as best you can, because it will eat you alive if you don't. And so you don't want to ignore it. That's not the point. That is absolutely not the message. But take it, understand it, try to be better, and move on. And I think that goes to in your self-assessments too, right? This is what I did. If it's an issue, here is how I improved, and I've moved on, and here's all the ways I've improved. And there we are. I think the other recommendation I would have in self-assessments is to not be quite too bullish, which is maybe a little counter to what we're talking about. But it certainly stands out to me when I read a review where the person is saying, I am the greatest thing that has ever happened to this law firm, and I single-handedly did X, Y, and Z. And the reality is none of us do it alone. We all work in teams. And so making sure that you are highlighting your accomplishments appropriately, but not taking all credit, because in some ways that will backfire. Certainly it backfires for me when I am reviewing self-assessments for various reasons. If there isn't a little bit of humility and a recognition that it takes more than one person to do what we do, it makes me question the advocacy, the self-advocacy as overstated. And that might just be a personal thing for me, but something that I would highlight as someone who reads reviews and uses those self-assessments and uses them to do reviews of others.
Yeah. And Gretchen, I think that goes back to what Linda was talking about at the start of the session, is that I was always told, make sure that when you talk about yourself, you're using the facts, right? To the extent that you are advocating for yourself, make sure you have the stats to back it up. And on that, a lot of these self-assessments, we know that you all as supervisors have all our stats. And I think some of us struggle with, okay, you have all my stats, you have my hours, you have all my credit information. What else do you want me to talk about? So I think from all of your perspective, what else do you want to hear from your direct reports? Are there any examples of reviews or self-advocacy that you've heard of from more junior folks that really hit home to you outside of the typical statistics?
I can see for myself, and I want to hear what's not on the page. I don't want to see a resuscitation of the 25 clients that you worked on and how many hours you billed for them. I want to hear about what was your role on a deal team, what was your role with the client, and how did you impact the client relationship or the deal team in a way that's not evident from the stats. And I would prefer limited good examples than 50 examples saying the same thing. I was the junior on the deal. And so that to me is really critical. And then I also focus a lot on citizenship and mentorship and things that you do for the greater good of the firm or that people do, and highlighting those, because those don't really show up in the stats in the same way. So I always tell folks, don't tell me what I already know. Tell me what I don't know. And those are the kinds of things that I find most impactful, because you're limited in how much you can say. And so make sure that you're using those words wisely.
Jess and Linda, are there in the finance world, outside of closing deals and bringing fees into your respective institutions, what else can your associates be doing to speak off the page?
Okay, so I had an associate write a self-assess, and the associate said that he constantly does what is in the best interest of the bank, and he has extremely high integrity and ethical standards, which is really true. And I, especially being in-house in banks today, which have all kinds of issues, reputational issues, every day there's a money laundering or overcharging clients, some kind of reputational risk, enterprise risk. And the fact that somebody believes, and really he does walk the talk, that character and integrity is really important, stands out. And that was, to me, I would say this person can be taught leveraged loan agreements and taught what the regulatory requirements are and all those things. But what is at the core of a person doesn't change. And so things about character and things about collaboration, the ability to collaborate and to bring other people in, especially in a large institution, are so important. The person in the corner that's hoarding everything and gatekeeping, it is the worst, especially in a bank, because there are so many risks and they have to be addressed, or in a financial institution. I used to think, oh my gosh, this is an over collaborative environment at certain previous institutions. Do I really have to bring in 10 people? But that you do actually get a benefit from that. As much as you think you can handle everything and you don't need to check with anybody, the ability to collaborate and work with people and make them feel like their contribution is valued is extremely important to me.
Yeah. And I would just add at BMO, everything we do is about the client, right? So as a junior employee, like really listening deeply, understanding the client need, being creative in how we can help the client solve their problems, connecting the dots. Absolutely. Just like Linda said, you got to think cross-functionally. There's so many aspects about client service that requires bringing in people across many groups. So really bringing like one bank to the client and really uncovering all the ways that we can help them solve problems. If junior employees can do that, they will succeed.
Great. Super helpful advice. Well, I think probably time for us to take this home. So I think for our last question is just, there's one additional piece of advice that you would want to leave our listeners with, or wish that you could tell to your younger self about how to be more confident in advocating for yourself, or how to better assess your own progress throughout the year?
I could start. I think the one piece of advice I would give is to do some self-reflection on what is important to you, and then use your self-promotion and advocacy chips for that. If it's salary, great. If it's position and title, great. If it's work, like the kinds of work that you want to do, great. If it's wanting more balance and family time or whatever, great. But I think sometimes we get caught up in the rat race, and what I always say is looking sideways, right? Well, that person's making more money than me and they shouldn't be. When I feel like I'm being compensated for what I do, and I have all these other things that I get to do or want to do or something like that. So I think it's really important to not fight for things you don't really care about, and to be disciplined and thoughtful about what you do. And then it's worth it, right? It's worth and I don't mean that the fight should be negative, but it's worth spending the time to get there on those things. But it won't land as well if you're pushing for absolutely everything, including things you don't care about.
That's great advice, Gretchen.
I would say, I know this is counterintuitive, but not to get too wrapped up in the evaluation process itself. And I think that's really what Gretchen is saying. That so you didn't get a 5, you got a 4, and you excelled on every metric you could this year, and you're wondering, like, why didn't I get rated the highest? I should have gotten the highest. Why didn't I get like this number of stock options. You know what? It's like not that important. These self-assessment and assessment cycles are important, but they're not the end all and be all. And I know I'm not going to make partners, blah, 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 or I'm not going to be a deputy general counsel, but things come in time. So you might have had an off-cycle year, or you didn't get what you thought you were going to get. It's not at the end of the world, and it's important to move on and self-assess your own goals and how it lines up, rather than always thinking about what you didn't get. And I think I've always faulted myself for comparing myself to others and wondering, I did all these things, and do I have the right title? Did I get the same amount of money? It's, so what? If I didn't, I know that I did a really amazing job, and I accomplished all my goals. Next year is a new year. And sometimes in this evaluation cycle, you really get too caught up in the evaluation cycle. And sometimes there are things that are outside of your control that really you can't control. And so it's best to take a healthy approach and think about what the goals are for the next year.
And I think that's great too. So I guess what I'll add is definitely early in my career, I thought if I put my head down, if I work hard, my work's going to speak for itself, right? And I'm going to ascend that corporate ladder. And I've definitely found that's not the case, right? So whether it's making those connections across your firm that can help speak on your behalf, whether it's making sure that you're really prepared for your formal performance process, because those are some naturally built in points in the year where it makes sense and it's a great forum to self-advocate, or whether it's building those peer relationships and really setting the precedent and making the case that we're going to lift each other up. I think everyone finds their own niche in the way that they feel comfortable self-advocating. So try out different ways and see what works for you and what's going to stick and what you feel comfortable with.
Great. Everyone, thank you so much for participating in this episode of Deal Us In. And thank you all for listening in.
Really, really appreciate the time today.
Thank you for joining us at the table for this episode of Deal Us In. If you have a recommendation for an inspiring interviewee, a question you'd like us to ask, or topic you would like to hear covered, or if you'd like to tell us about women-focused initiatives in the field, please email us at wpef@McGuireWoods.com. We look forward to hearing from you. This podcast was recorded and is being made available by McGuireWoods for informational purposes only. By accessing this podcast, you acknowledge that McGuireWoods makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in the podcast. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this podcast series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect those of McGuireWoods. This podcast should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice from a licensed professional attorney in your state and should not be construed as an offer to make or consider any investment or course of action.